You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Lindsey Wade, author of In My DNA, My Career Investigating Your Worst Nightmares. Lindsey, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Before we get into our discussion on the reason we wanted you to speak with us today, which is the CODIS Gap, we wanted to go ahead and extend our congratulations on the fact that your book has been nominated as one of the best true crime books of the year at the CrimeCon CLUE Awards.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited about that. I was very surprised to receive that nomination. Yes, I'm just happy to be in good company.
So how did you find out that In My DNA was named one of the top true crime books of the year? Now, by the time we air this episode, they will have announced who won the grand prize. It is truly an honor to be nominated. So how did you find out about it?
I got an email, and yes, got an email from CrimeCon, or I guess actually from the CLUE Awards, technically, letting me know that my book was one of 5 finalists for the category of Book of the Year. Yeah, I was pretty blown away.
And they will
and of
be
course, now I'm like frantically reading all the other books on the in the group because I want to read everybody's book before I get there, so I know who I'm dealing with.
We're very excited, that you're in that amazing group of people, because it is a pretty heady category and lots of really wonderfully accomplished people. And of course, my most important question at the moment is, what are you planning to wear to the CLUE Awards? Because we've all been invited. So What are you planning to wear?
Funny you should ask, because I have no idea. I probably have a couple different things that I'm going to bring, but I guess it'll just depend on how bloated I am or whatever that day as to what I end up wearing.
This is such a women's discussion. Like, Kristin asked me earlier today what I was wearing to the CLUE Awards. And I
did ask you. Yes, I did.
Quite frankly, being a guy, I hadn't thought about it in the least.
Yes, women have to do, there's a lot more of a process that goes into it for the ladies. Yeah.
But I'm also telling you,
I probably will wear a dress of some kind.
Nice. Yeah, bring a couple. I had a couple with me last year, and I finally decided on my favorite. But yeah. Bill, I got to tell you, that Paul Holes and Matt Murphy have put a lot of thought into what they're wearing to the CLUE Awards. So you're going to have to step up your game a little bit.
I'm not even attempting to compete at the level of Paul Holes or Matt Murphy, both of whom are big-time true crime sex symbols, if we are still allowed to use that expression.
Lindsey, before we get started talking about the CODIS Gap, very quickly remind our listeners a little bit about your background as an investigator.
Sure. So my background is law enforcement. So I'm a retired detective out of Washington State. Spent 21 years with the Tacoma Police Department. 14 of those years I spent as a detective. Primarily worked sexual assault cases, missing persons, homicide cases, child abuse cases. And then when I retired, I was the cold case detective when I retired from my agency. And then I went to work for the Attorney General of our state for just under 5 years as an investigator, working on the sexual assault kit initiative, and then worked on some other, we have a unit within the Attorney General's office, which is called HITS, which is the Homicide Investigation and Tracking System Unit. And that was actually started by Bob Keppel, for any true crime fans, that name. So Bob started that unit. Now I'm just in the private sector, still keeping my finger on the pulse of what's going on in the world of crime.
So how'd you get your start with the Tacoma Police Department? Is this something when you were a kid, you thought, I want to be an investigator, I want to be a detective?
I actually knew when I was in high school that I wanted to be a detective. And I actually was inspired by reading Anne Rule's book, The Stranger Beside Me. I think I was a sophomore in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I was hooked at that point. And I guess I was a true crime nerd before that was the thing, when it was still really weird and awkward and we didn't talk about that kind of stuff. I knew from that point on, and I had a friend in school. Her dad was a police officer, so I was exposed on the periphery, so to speak, to a little bit of police work, police life. I had another friend, family friend, who was a police officer. Then I did an internship with the police department when I was in college with a female sergeant. Yeah, it was like everything I did along the way, it was like it just made me more and more certain that this was what I wanted to do and this was the job I wanted. And then when I was in college, I was actually in my junior year of college and I got hired by the police department. I had taken the written test and gone through the whole process of the physical and the psychological and the medical and everything you have to do. And they offered me a job. And so I ended up quitting school to go work for the police department at the ripe old age of 21. And went to the police academy. And luckily, the police department actually did tuition reimbursement. So I was able to go back and finish my degree later on after I was a detective.
Very cool. So you wrote a really fascinating article called DNA's Delayed Justice, the Fight to Fill the Gaps in CODIS, which really resonated with the two of us in light of our own interests, both within the crime and justice space and, of course, the Colonial Parkway murders. What prompted you to sit down and write this particular article at this particular time?
Wow. There was a recent cold case that was solved as a result of getting DNA into CODIS from a long forgotten, really bad guy who was executed in Washington State back in 1994. As a result of finally getting his DNA into CODIS, a cold case from 1975 was resolved. This is a topic that I have been very interested in, and I would say slightly obsessed with since about 2011, when I first stumbled across this issue. Over the years, have found example after example of really scary guys, really violent offenders who, for one reason or another, slipped through the cracks and were not ever in the DNA database for the purpose of solving cases. Most recent example, it's like a culmination of many years of all these different cases. And then here's this latest example. And I thought it was definitely worthy of getting the word out to law enforcement specifically to hopefully make people take notice and take a look at what's going on in their own jurisdictions. That this particular case would not have been solved without changing legislation in Washington State. And so that was necessary to even get this person's DNA into CODIS. So that was one piece of it. There were just so many factors and so much work over many years to get that. But I think it's just a really great example of what can be done and hopefully a model that other states could use to do the same kind of thing.
Let's talk about the case a little bit first before we get to the long and very worthwhile effort that you and others put into actually changing the law in Washington State. So tell us a little bit more about the case itself and how this ended up moving onto your radar as an investigator.
Really, I knew about the offender. I didn't know about the victim. So it's like a backwards way of working a case. That's really how it happened in this instance, because I became aware of the offender in this case many years ago. And he was like my poster child for, hey, everybody pay attention. We need to make some changes in CODIS because this is a problem. So when I would go down to Olympia, our state capital, and testify in front of various committees about changing our DNA law, I would always use him as my prime example of this really heinous offender that slipped through the cracks and is currently not in CODIS. Knowing about him, and this is what I learned about him, I was working on a cold case and I was reviewing a list of convicted offenders that were not in CODIS, and he was one name on that list. And what really caught my attention initially was that when I looked in the status column, this is like an Excel spreadsheet that I was reviewing, in the status column it said executed. And so I was like, that's interesting. And I could see that he had 3 convictions for aggravated first-degree murder, which is the highest level of murder that you could be convicted of in my state. And so I thought, this is interesting. I want to dig into this guy and find out what he actually did, because this is scary that he's not in CODIS. And so I went down the rabbit hole, looking at his criminal history, Googling, looking at basically anything I could get my hands on to try to get a handle on who this person was. And what I came to learn was that he was a career criminal. He had committed a stranger sexual assault back in 1974. He had gone to prison. And even though he was sentenced to 30 years in prison, he was out in less than 6 years.
Wow.
Yeah, we both were just like horrified when we read that. Like, how in the world does a 30-year sentence turn into 6 years and the guy's out on work release?
Yeah, and unfortunately, that was not uncommon during those times back in the 70s and 80s. It was not uncommon for people to get sentenced to really long sentences and be out in 5 years or less. But that's a different matter. Nevertheless, he was released. The victim wasn't notified that he was released from prison, and he actually was living in a halfway house very close to where she lived. And so within less than a year of him being on work release, he returned to her home and murdered her 8-year-old daughter, and her neighbor. It was probably one of the most outrageous and shocking crimes that really ever occurred in Washington state. It really just horrified people. He was arrested very soon after. I don't think it took a rocket scientist to figure out who did it. He was ultimately convicted of the 3 murders, and he was put to death. He was actually the last person in Washington state to be hanged in 1994. So learning all of that history, I thought, okay, this is a really dangerous, predatory offender. He's not in CODIS. So I thought, okay, I'm going to find a sample for this guy, and he needs to be in the system. And part of my thought process when I would look at these cases was, maybe this will solve the cases that I'm working on. Maybe this person's DNA will help solve these other cases. So that was always in my mind when I was looking at these kinds of offenders. And I knew that this particular offender was not going to be responsible for the 2 cases that I was investigating from '86, because he was already in custody by that point. But I still thought he could be responsible for other cold cases, so he really needs to be in the database. So I started doing some checking and was really excited to find out that there actually was either a blood card or a tissue block available at the medical examiner's office from his autopsy. And so I got all excited. I called the crime lab just to be told that he didn't qualify to go into CODIS.
No, let's just stop for a second. We're both like making the OMFG face here. How in the world does someone this heinous, who's already been convicted of rape and now gets out of prison on work release, tracks down the woman that he attacked before, brutally kills her 8-year-old daughter, and their neighbor who was also a witness? How in the world is that guy's DNA not in the system in Washington state?
The reason he wasn't in the system already is because he was convicted before there were even DNA laws. He was convicted before anybody was using DNA in criminal investigations. However, the real issue was that he didn't qualify to go in 2011 or whenever it was that I found his name. He didn't qualify to go into the database for the same reasons. He was convicted before the law went into effect. Mm-hmm. He died before it became retroactive for inmates. And so basically he fell into this loophole or gap in the system.
So yet another example of the CODIS Gap. If you don't mind, spend a minute or two explaining for us, we're civilians, what the CODIS Gap means.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's not just one gap. There are lots of different reasons why offenders are missing from the database. Some of those are legislative issues that have to be corrected. Some of them are policy issues. Some of them are just because they were just missed, and no one has gone back and taken a look at who actually owes DNA in their jurisdiction and how do we get it collected. For a lot of states, the way that the law is written for DNA collection is extremely convoluted. Sometimes I think it was written that way on purpose so that there could be lots of different ways to get that DNA collected and into the system. But when you do that and you don't lay out a specific path that needs to be taken and a specific person who's responsible, Then what happens? Everybody points the finger at somebody else, right? No, it's their responsibility. No, your responsibility to do it. No, you'll collect it when they get to prison. Oh, no, you'll get it at the jail. Oh, I thought you were going to collect it in the courtroom. And these are all places where people's DNA theoretically could be taken. And oftentimes everyone assumes somebody else did it, and then it doesn't get done.
Is there some reason why they can't take it in all three places just to make sure that they've covered their bases? I feel like there needs to be a flow chart here, but I'm also wondering, why don't we have multiple redundancies worked into the system just in case I forgot it at the courtroom? Don't worry, we've got it at the jail cell and we've got it elsewhere too.
That's a good question. And I would say that the reason, not that I agree with this, but the reason that most jurisdictions wouldn't want to collect it multiple times is because it's a drain on resources. Even the collection kits to collect the sample, you would think it was just like a Q-tip. And that's not actually what happens when you collect a convicted offender sample. There's a bit more that goes into it, to include taking fingerprints, documenting what the qualifying offense was. There's a little bit more that goes into it, and there's a cost associated with those kits. I think that's part of the issue, but the bigger problem, in my opinion, is that we just have too many points along the way where someone can be missed. As you said, there needs to be a flow chart, and unfortunately, everybody in the criminal justice system doesn't follow the same path when they are convicted, right? Some people, when they are convicted for a qualifying offense, go to jail. Some people go to prison. Some people get home monitoring. Some people get probation. So depending on what their path is, will oftentimes dictate when and if their sample is collected.
Well, one of the things that really shocked me in the article, and we'll include a copy of your link to your article in the show notes for this episode, was the fact that in some jurisdictions there seems to be a policy that offenders only give their DNA when they're being released from prison. So they've gone in, they've served their sentence, they're being released back out into the community, hopefully not to reoffend. And yet that's the time their DNA is often taken. And that seems completely backwards to us.
Oh, yeah. You want to go track somebody down after you released them if you get a hit and now go find them again? No. And that is an old school mentality, and that's an old school policy to collect DNA upon release. I hope that most correctional facilities are not doing that any longer, but that certainly was the standard and the norm back earlier on when DNA laws were first being implemented. And I don't really, coming from a cold case investigator perspective, I don't understand what kind of sense that makes. Just like you pointed out, I think their thought process was, we'll get it before they leave, and they're not hurting anybody while they're in here, so it doesn't really matter.
And I push back on this a lot as the family of a murder victim.
Right.
It isn't just about he's about to re-enter society, hopefully to be successful and not be continuing his criminal ways. But for you as an investigator to find out that he's already out back in the community, possibly reoffending, versus when you're working an investigation actively and going through a cold case, wouldn't it make a heck of a lot more sense if you said, I think my guy is Joe Smith, and Joe Smith is at such and such prison, and I can go visit with him and reconfirm via DNA that I've got the right guy, or maybe I should be looking for another Joe Smith.
Correct. Yeah, a controlled environment is definitely the better solution there. Once someone is released, you don't know where they're going to go or what's going to happen or what they're going to do after they're released. Collecting at the time of release is not a great solution, in my opinion.
One of the things I was really interested in when I read your article is the fact that Ted Bundy's DNA isn't in CODIS. That kind of blew my mind. How did that happen? He is probably one of the most notorious serial killers of our times. How does he not have his DNA in CODIS? That really just blows my mind.
Yes, so that blew my mind as well. And that was another, for some reason, 2011 was the year for me to learn about all these crazy things happening. And Ted Bundy was at the top of the list that year of shockers. I think before that, I just assumed that if you're a serial killer, your DNA is going to be in the national database for the purpose of linking cases together. But that's not necessarily the case. Really, it goes back to a lot of these guys that were operating in the 70s, 80s, even the 90s. they probably were convicted before a DNA law was even on the books in their jurisdiction. And depending on the state and depending on what their policies and procedures were and what their DNA statute says, the prison officials may not have ever gone back and collected from these guys if they were already locked up when the prison started routinely collecting samples from inmates. And this is very common to see offenders that went in before the DNA laws even went into effect. They just got forgotten about. Now, there are even some states that actually are not allowed to go back and collect DNA samples from individuals today who were locked up before the DNA law went into effect. And so unless there's specific language in the statute about retroactivity, they don't qualify.
This is the sort of thing that makes me insane.
Oh, yes, I know.
And I've talked to law enforcement officials about this. This isn't just about convicting people. This is also about providing answers. And I know how victim-centric you are and how family-focused you are. The fact that there are offenders, including people that are rapists and murderers and multiple offenders and serial killers, whose DNA is not in the CODIS system. Kristin said Ted Bundy obviously is the super high-profile example, but you actually worked to get his DNA, Bundy's DNA, into the system, even though he was in Florida and you're all the way in Washington State. How did that work?
Believe it or not, our oldest cold case on the books in Tacoma is the 1961 abduction of Anne Marie Burr. And she was an 8-year-old who went missing from her home in the middle of the night in Tacoma. Her case is still unsolved today. She's never been found. Ted Bundy came onto the scene as a suspect in her case after he was revealed to be who he was. He was also born and raised in Tacoma. He also lived in the north end of Tacoma. And there were lots of wild rumors, right? Oh, he was her paper boy. They knew each other. None of that stuff is true. But the fact of the matter is he was a high-profile serial killer living in Tacoma at the time this girl went missing. He, of course, was a suspect in her case. Now, he was only 14 at the time that she went missing. And there's lots of debate about whether or not he actually could have done it. But aside from that, I thought, okay, we're going to be re-examining this cold case. We're going to be sending things out to the crime lab for testing. Do we even have anything to compare to if we get some DNA evidence from this crime scene, from these crime scene items that were collected in 1961? And so I started making calls again and quickly found out, no, Ted Bundy's DNA is not in CODIS in Washington because he's not been convicted of any crimes in Washington. Even though he confessed to 11 murders in Washington, he was never convicted for any in Washington. So he doesn't qualify for CODIS in Washington, but he was convicted in Florida, and that's where he was ultimately executed. So I ended up contacting authorities in Florida, contacted a medical examiner's office where he had his autopsy after he was executed. They had tried to do DNA testing at one point, but it was the old style RFLP DNA testing,
right,
which doesn't talk to CODIS. It's a different type of testing. And they didn't have anything left to do current DNA testing using STRs. So then it was like, okay, who else can I call? So I ended up calling the Florida State CODIS administrator. So like every state has basically a manager of their CODIS database. So I call him and he tells me that he gets calls several times a year from detectives asking him the same question from all over the country. Is Ted Bundy's DNA in CODIS? His answer was no, it's not. And so I'm like, okay, this is the problem. So how do we fix this? How do we find a sample? So we put our heads together and came up with a strategy for locating a sample. I decided that I was going to reach out to Ann Rule here in Washington because Ann had read her books, and I knew that she had written Bundy in prison and he had written her, and I knew that she kept the letters that he wrote her with stamp.
Oh, wow.
Interesting thought. Wow.
Wow.
And so I was like, I don't know, it probably won't qualify for CODIS, but even if we could get a profile to do a keyboard search or a one-to-one comparison, it could be better than nothing. So I met with Ann Rule, got to have lunch with her.
That's cool in and of itself.
Yeah, which was really cool.
Uh-huh.
She signed my book, The Stranger Beside Me, which was
there you go.
Which is one of the reasons why you got into the field in the first place.
And then she handed me multiple letters and envelopes that she had been keeping in her safe for all these years. And so I took those back to the police department, and my intent was to send those out to the crime lab. At the same time, the CODIS administrator in Florida had located these wax molds of Bundy's teeth. So after he got arrested for the Chi Omega murders, they took wax molds of his teeth because he had very unusual teeth, but there were bite marks on at least one of the victims. Mm-hmm. They still had the wax molds of his teeth at the crime lab. Apparently they have like a Bundy museum of sorts at the crime lab. Ooh. They had these wax molds. He attempted to swab those and potentially get a profile from the wax molds, but he didn't get enough of a profile to develop for CODIS. But he was able to somehow locate a vial of Bundy's blood that had been collected in 1978 at the time of his arrest in Pensacola. And it was in a safe in a clerk's office at room temperature.
I was going to say this was sitting in a refrigerator somewhere, right?
No refrigerator. A room temperature safe in Florida since 1978.
Oh my gosh. Less than ideal.
Yeah. So that's not going to be good. That blood is going to be completely
broken down.
So he wasn't hopeful that he was going to be able to get anything from it. But miraculously, while the blood itself in the vial was not going to be worth anything, there was dried blood on the lid of the vacutainer. Oh. And so he was able to flake off a couple of little pieces of dried blood.
Uh-huh.
Wow. There was enough there to get a full profile.
It worked.
Holy cow.
Then the profile was entered into Florida's database, and that's where it was going to stay because he didn't qualify to go into the national database.
But wait a minute.
So,
this makes no sense. We're both looking at each other like, what?
That's what I said. So I'm like, this is good. I'm glad that he's in Florida's database, but that doesn't help if he's not in the national database. Let's say he committed a homicide or a sexual assault in Washington, and we've got evidence on a case in Washington that doesn't meet the criteria to make it up to the national database. We'll never get a match. And basically, after some legal wrangling with the INDIS custodian, and INDIS is the national DNA database, it was decided that the sample would go into the national database in the legal index. So he is not in the offender index, he's in the legal index. However, the legal index still searches against the crime scene or forensic index. So that's basically what we need. We need his profile to be searching against crime scene profiles, and it is now, as of 2012.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Before we get back to the podcast, just wanted to remind you that we have a GoFundMe effort going on right now. This campaign is designed to help us raise funds to help promote Mind Over Murder and specifically to push the Colonial Parkway Murders investigation forward. We'd love it if you could support us in any way that you can. Any donation from $5 to whatever you can afford is very much appreciated and will be incredibly helpful. The link is in the show notes and in our social media pages. As always, thanks for your support. Now back to Mind Over Murder.
So I don't understand. Why do CODIS laws and policies vary from state to state? Wouldn't it just make more sense to have one set of national policies, and that way we are all on the same page 100% of the time? Or am I don't know. Am I thinking about it too simplistically here? Or it seems like the obvious answer would be, yes, it's better to have one set of policies. Why are we doing 50 states, 50 policies?
I think the reason is because every state gets to make their own laws, and CODIS rules are directly related to the laws in that particular state. One state can do certain things, another state cannot. Some states take DNA upon arrest, and some states like mine do not. Every state, because they all have different laws, With regard to who owes a DNA sample, that makes it very convoluted and very complicated because every state then has a different standard for who can be entered into the database.
I'm going to chime in here and say this is insane. The fact that we have allowed this system to develop, this makes no sense whatsoever. Offenders offend all over the place. Mm-hmm. And the Bundy example that we just spoke about, which was fascinating, but I had forgotten that he had lived in Tacoma, Washington, and yet I associate him with offenses in other parts of the country. And of course, we know the story about Florida because we've talked with Kathy Kleiner-Rubin about surviving Ted Bundy's attack when she was a college student in Florida. This makes no sense. And I'll go a step further. Now, I'm not a professional, and Kristin isn't either, but I am the brother of a murder victim. It's my intention to pivot when we solve the Colonial Parkway murders. It's my intention to pivot to this larger issue of 250,000 cold case homicides across the United States. This is so half-assed as to not be believed. We're not running the country like a real country. You can't have 50 different sets of rules. We need one set of rules for the entire country. And quite frankly, I think the databases should all be shared as well. Yeah. And I thought that was the idea of CODIS. It feels to me like we need to revamp this entire system. I can't believe that every single state, Virginia in the Colonial Parkway Murders example, every state has a different set of rules and parameters, as Kristin was saying. This is insane.
It's very complicated, and I completely understand your frustration because I've lived it. I can't even tell you how many times I just felt like banging my head against a wall because things that seem like common sense are not necessarily. And unfortunately, what it's going to take is legislation. That's the bottom line. Is it's going to take either some type of federal legislation to mandate that all the states have the same rules, or each individual state's going to have to amend their DNA collection statutes so that everyone's on the same page. And honestly, you can't even get all the states to agree on collecting DNA upon arrest. So
I think we need one set of rules, and I think the lack of leadership by the Department of Justice here is shocking. For God's sake, develop one set of parameters, and these will oversee what should be a federal system. You can't have one set of rules in Oklahoma and a different set of rules in Tennessee or Washington State and Florida. It just doesn't make any sense.
Unfortunately, yeah, every state has their own DNA database. And so I don't know if you're really familiar with how CODIS works. But CODIS is a software. That's what CODIS is. It's a software program. The DNA database itself, there are multiple levels of what we call CODIS. So there's oftentimes states will have local levels of CODIS where maybe their individual crime labs have a database within the state. And then they've got their Estes database, which is their state database. And then there's the national database. And so the samples that are in the state database, if they meet the criteria, they can be uploaded to the national database. And then they can be searched against other profiles that are in the national database. So that the only DNA database that the FBI controls is the national DNA database. The other ones are controlled by the states. Now, they still have to abide by CODIS rules, which are set forth by the FBI. But again, they have to abide by their own state laws as to whose DNA can go into the system. And I mentioned earlier that there are samples that don't meet the requirement to go into the national database. That's something that I don't think most people know or understand. There are some cases, both offender samples and crime scene evidence samples, that don't make it into the national database. And this is because the sample may not have obtained enough core loci or locations on the genome identified when they did the DNA testing to upload it to the national database. Most state DNA databases have a lower threshold and a lower number of core loci that they have to obtain in order to enter that profile into their state level. But once you go up to national, The standard is higher, right? Because you have more profiles, so you have to be more discerning with those profiles. That's something that even a lot of investigators don't understand when they're working cold cases, is when someone tells you, oh yes, the profile's in CODIS, you should be asking where, what level.
Lindsey, I feel like we need to sit down at CrimeCon and come up with a flow chart that shows all of these different levels of it, because even now you've just explained it so beautifully, but I'm not going to be able to retain this because there's not because of the way that you've explained it or anything like that, but just because it is head spinning. It just seems so counterintuitive. It really does feel like it should be the national database and the state databases feed into it. You're saying that it doesn't work like that, and that's making me go, but why? I'm sure that's very frustrating.
It is. And I would say more than, I think at this point, as an investigator, you just have to really educate yourself if you're going to work cold cases. You better understand how CODIS works and understand that just because you have a suspect that's in prison doesn't mean they're in CODIS. Just because your suspect's in CODIS doesn't mean they're at the national level of CODIS. Just because your crime scene evidence is in CODIS doesn't mean it's at the national level of CODIS. They need to understand, like, how do I confirm that? How do I find this out? And then if it's not, what do I do about it?
So theoretically, is there a way to get 100% of all offenders currently incarcerated into CODIS? Is there a way to do this? Or is it just not going to work the way that we optimistically want it to?
That's a trick question, Kristin, because
not intentionally.
Not intentionally at all. Like this is from a civilian standpoint, right. Someone who wants the best for victims. That my question is, why can't we go through and just swab everybody and toss them all in there? I'm guessing that isn't the answer, though.
Theoretically, we should be able to do that. It really depends, and I hate to go back to the state, but it depends on that particular state's law. If their law is retroactive, so that's one hurdle. And then two is actually getting somebody to go back and count. It doesn't take legislation. It doesn't take anything special. It just takes someone to go back and actually do a census or a survey to identify, okay, I want a list of everybody in prison in our state, and then we're going to cross-reference that against the CODIS database and find out who's in there and who's not. That's not rocket science.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that that's not happening. This has not yet been identified as a major issue nationally.
I'm making the aha face because I actually think we've talked with you about this before. We've talked with Rock Harmon and other experts about this. I actually think we need to steer this in a direction where this becomes a national conversation. The other thing is, I've said on Mind Over Murder, and Kristin has too, the fact that there are 250,000 cold case homicides, which may be a conservative number even, that is not something that's well known in our opinion and should be a national scandal, because we've all watched these procedurals on TV, which are fun to watch, but as we all know, not terribly realistic. We've all been sold a bill of goods, which is that we think that crimes are solved quickly and easily in state-of-the-art labs with lots of colored water or something going up and down with bubbles, and exceptionally well-dressed and often quite lovely people, both women and men, solving all of these cases in 48 minutes or less. And yet you're here to tell us that's not the reality.
No. I fully understand where you're coming from on the cold cases. Why do we not have a national cold case database?
Yeah.
Yes.
A damn good question.
We agree. And I will give Virginia mad props here. Virginia just started a cold case database. Hats off to them for doing it. The issue that I have found, though, as someone who goes scrolling through the cold case database here in Virginia on the regular, is it is almost impossible to use. It is very hard to search. It is, even when you put in the names of people that you know to be victims, they don't always come up. Not every cold case is in there, and we don't have a really good explanation for why that might or might not be. I love the idea of a national cold case database, but if it is done, boy, I hope it's going to be managed a little bit better and made a little more user-friendly than some of the ones that I know are at the various state levels. But
honestly, we need to get Amazon to build it, right? Because all you got to do is just look at your Amazon cart and it knows what you're searching for. So basically, you just have to talk about Amazon, and now you've got all these suggestions about things you might like. That's basically what you need your cold case database to do, right? You're searching for this person. Now it's going to give you a list automatically of other cases that potentially might be associated.
Yeah,
Seriously, the people who run Amazon need to be doing all of this stuff. Like, they've clearly got it together. They have somehow managed to optimize it. We need this as well.
Yes.
That's because our phones listen to our conversations and then suddenly start suggesting things.
Yes.
But perhaps we should talk more loudly in the kitchen sometime about the fact that we need a national cold case database.
Yes, exactly. And maybe that's I was trying to think, I don't know who else is going to be at CrimeCon, but there have to be some movers and shakers and people there that could make something like this happen. I don't know. And it doesn't seem like rocket science. We do have NamUs, which is great. NamUs is for unidentifieds and missing persons. It is not cold case homicides.
I don't want to let you off the call without asking you a little bit about the SAKI grant program, Sexual Assault Kit Initiative program, because the SAKI program here in Virginia is actually what led to the recent identification of an offender in 3 of the cases associated with the Colonial Parkway murders.
Let me just ask one generalized question. Why are the numbers so low of the number of law enforcement agencies that are utilizing the SAKI grants? Here, as Kristin said just a moment ago, the folks at the Virginia Department of Forensic Science applied for SAKI grants, which we totally supported, and that led directly to the identification of an offender after 37 years of waiting for answers. So we're thrilled, and we really appreciate the work that's being done. Do you have any sense of how could we make the SAKI program more widely used? Is that a fair question and one you could answer?
It's available to any law enforcement agency that applies. Not that everyone would get it if they apply. Like, it's a federal grant. You have to apply and you have to respond to a solicitation that comes out annually. And it's a standard federal grant. And I'm pretty sure most law enforcement agencies are well aware of the federal grants that are available.
Yeah, I'd love to see it more widely used. And of course, we're an example of here's a case now that's very near and dear to our hearts that's moving forward again because Virginia applied for and got SAKI grants, and they're out there working it. Our understanding is they're continuing to do so. And this gives families like mine and folks across the country real hope that their cases are going to be solved. And we understand that in a case like ours that's 37 years old, there was a real good chance that this offender and perhaps others, we understand they may be dead. It's been a long time. But at the same time, those answers that I mentioned a few minutes ago are so important, and they're incredibly meaningful to the family.
Yeah. And I'm a really big proponent of evaluating deceased offenders for lawfully owed DNA collections for that very reason, because I've taught classes and given presentations on collecting DNA samples from offenders who have slipped through the cracks. And oftentimes people will say, why does it matter? Why do you care about collecting samples from somebody who's dead? Just exactly as you just stated, because someone out there is waiting for an answer. Someone wants to know what happened to their loved one. Victims want answers. And frankly, do you really want your law enforcement agencies spending time and resources investigating cases and spinning their wheels when the answer could be sitting right in front of them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Exactly.
And as you were saying at the top of this conversation, in the example that you walked us through, that was a situation where the offender had been put to death by the state of Washington years before, and yet answers were provided as a result of your and your teams working together to look for these answers. The offender dispatched, but the answers for those families were incredibly important and meaningful. And that's my reminder to everybody in law enforcement. It isn't just about putting offenders away or appropriate levels of punishment. It's also for answers for those families that are waiting sometimes for decades.
Absolutely. This most recent case was almost 50 years old, 49 years old. that victim's family for 49 years had no idea who was responsible. I don't know if it helps them to know who did it. I don't know that. I can say that I hope it gives them at least some peace of mind that law enforcement didn't forget about them and that someone still cared enough to still work on it. And that Charles Campbell was never a suspect in that case. He was not on the radar for that case at all in any way, shape, or form. Never would have been linked to that case otherwise had it not been for the DNA.
I can say for sure that in the Colonial Parkway murders, we've spoken to those other family members who received this news. And Kristin and I talked about this several times recently. I hope people can understand that when you've been looking for answers for that long, it's actually good news to have a question that's been hanging over your family for decades have an answer. The answer was never going to be a truly satisfying one, but at least they know what happened to their loved one, and they have a somewhat better understanding of how and why this happened. It was never going to make complete sense, and it wasn't going to be acceptable to them, but they have answers that they've been seeking for more than 30 years.
Exactly. For a lot of victims and survivors and family members of victims, I don't know if satisfied is the right word, but they are pleased with just receiving news that someone is working on the case and that someone cares and that they haven't been forgotten. Even if at the end of the day, they don't get what they ultimately wanted, or maybe they don't get the sentence that they ultimately wanted, or maybe the offender's dead and so they don't actually get punished. As you said, sometimes it's just having the answer. And I just from my experience working with victims and with family members of victims, I've had people tell me that it really just changed a lot of things for them, just knowing that someone actually cared about them enough to pick up the phone or drive to their house, sit down with them and talk. And not everybody wants that, but some people do. And people they want to know that the police or the law enforcement agency still actually cares about them, and that they're not just a number or a statistic, or that they have been moved to the side to handle current cases that are coming in.
Very well said.
So, Lindsey, we will put a link to your article in our show notes, but tell everybody where they can find your book, In My DNA.
My book is available anywhere you can buy books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, or you can buy it directly from the publisher's website, which is actually better for me. So if you can order it from oneideapress.com.
Lindsey, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at CrimeCon in just a couple of days.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.